Section 1 of Elizabethan Demonology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Davis. Elizabethan Demonology by Thomas Alfred Spalding. Section 1. It is impossible to understand and appreciate thoroughly the production of any great literary genius who lived and wrote in times far removed from our own, without a certain amount of familiarity, not only with the precise shades of meaning possessed by the vocabulary he made use of, as distinguished from the sense conveyed by the same words in the present day, but also with the customs and ideas, political, religious, and moral, that predominated during the period in which his works were produced. Without such information, it will be found impossible, in many matters of the first importance, to grasp the writer's true intent, and much will appear vague and lifeless that was full of point and vigor when it was first conceived. Or, worse still, modern opinion upon the subject will be set up as the standard of interpretation. Ideas will be forced into the writer's sentences that could not, by any manner of possibility, have had place in his mind, and utterly false conclusions as to his meaning will be the result. Even the man who has had some experience in the study of an early literature occasionally finds some difficulty in preventing the current opinions of his day from obtruding themselves upon his work and warping his judgment. To the general reader, this must indeed be a frequent and serious stumbling block. This is a special source of danger in the study of the works of dramatic poets, whose very art lies in the representation of the current opinions, habits, and foibles of their times, in holding up the mirror to their age. It is true that, if their works are to live, they must deal with subjects of more than mere passing interest. But it is also true that many, and the greatest of them, speak upon questions of eternal interest in the particular light cast upon them in their times. And it is quite possible that the truth may be entirely lost, from want of power to recognize it under the disguise in which it comes. A certain motive, for instance, that is an overpowering one in a given period, subsequently appears grotesque, weak, or even powerless. The consequent action becomes incomprehensible, and the actor is contemned, and a simile that appeared most appropriate in the ears of the author's contemporaries seems meaningless or ridiculous to later generations. An example or two of this possibility of error, derived from works produced during the period with which it is the object of these pages to deal, will not be out of place here. A very striking illustration of the manner in which a word may mislead is afforded by the oft-quoted line, "Assume a virtue if you have it not." By most readers, the secondary and, in the present day, almost universal meaning of the word assume, pretend that to be which in reality has no existence. That is, in the particular case, ape the chastity you do not in reality possess, is understood in this sentence. And consequently Hamlet, and through him Shakespeare, stand committed to the appalling doctrine that hypocrisy in morals is to be commended and cultivated. Now, such a proposition never for an instant entered Shakespeare's head. He used the word assume in this case in its primary and justest sense, ad sumo, take to, acquire. And the context plainly shows that Hamlet meant that his mother, by self-denial, would gradually acquire that virtue in which she was so conspicuously wanting. Yet, for lack of a little knowledge of the history of the word employed, the other monstrous gloss has received almost universal and applauding acceptance. This is a fair example of the style of error which a reader unacquainted with the history of the changes our language has undergone may fall into. Ignorance of changes in customs and morals may cause equal or greater error. The difference between the older and more modern law and popular opinion relating to promises of marriage and their fulfillment affords a striking illustration of the absurdities that attend upon the interpretation of the ideas of one generation by the practice of another. Perhaps no greater nonsense has been talked upon any subject than this one, especially in relation to Shakespeare's own marriage by critics who seem to have thought that a fervent expression of acute moral feeling would replace and render unnecessary patient investigation. In illustration of this difference, a play of Massinger's, The Maid of Honour, may be advantageously cited, as the catastrophe turns upon this question of marriage contracts. Camiola, the heroine, having been pre-contracted by oath to Bertoldo, the king's natural brother, and hearing of his subsequent engagement to the Duchess of Siena, determines to quit the world and take the veil. But before doing so, and without informing anyone, except her confessor, of her intention, she contrives a somewhat dramatic scene for the purpose of exposing her false lover. She comes into the presence of the king and all the court, produces her contract, claims Bertoldo as her husband, and demands justice of the king, adjuring him that he shall not, swayed, or by favour or affection, by a false gloss or wrested comment, alter the true intent and letter of the law. Now, the only remedy that would occur to the mind of the reader of the present day, under such circumstances, would be an action for breach of promise of marriage, and he would probably be aware of the very recent origin of that method of procedure. The only reply, therefore, that he would expect from Roberto would be a mild and sympathetic assurance of inability to interfere, and he must be somewhat taken aback to find this claim of Camiola admitted as indisputable. The riddle becomes somewhat further involved when, having established her contract, she immediately intimates that she has not the slightest intention of observing it herself by declaring her desire to take the veil. This can only be explained by the rules current at the time regarding spousals. The betrothal, or hand-fasting, was, in Massinger's time, a ceremony that entailed very serious obligations upon the parties to it. There were two classes of spousals, sponsalio de futuro and sponsalia de presenti, a promise of marriage in the future, and an actual declaration of present marriage. This last form of betrothal was, in fact, marriage, as far as the contracting parties were concerned. It could not, even though not consummated, be dissolved by mutual consent, and a subsequent marriage, even though celebrated with religious rites, was utterly invalid, and could be set aside at the suit of the injured person. The results entailed by sponsalia de futuro were less serious. Although no spousals of the same nature could be entered into with a third person during the existence of the contract, yet it could be dissolved by mutual consent, and was dissolved by subsequent sponsalia in presenti, or matrimony. But such spousals could be converted into valid matrimony by the cohabitation of the parties, and this, instead of being looked upon as reprehensible, seems to have been treated as a laudable action, and to be by all means encouraged. In addition to this, completion of a contract for marriage de futuro, confirmed by oath, if such a contract were not indeed indissoluble, as was thought by some, could at any rate be enforced against an unwilling party. But there were some reasons that justified the dissolution of sponsalia of either description. Affinity was one of these, and, what is to the purpose here, in England before the Reformation, and in those parts of the continent unaffected by it, the entrance into a religious order was another. Here, then, we have a full explanation of Camiola's conduct. She is in possession of evidence of a contract of marriage between herself and Bertoldo, which, whether in presenti or in futuro, being confirmed by oath, she can force upon him, and which will invalidate his proposed marriage with the Duchess. Having established her right, she takes the only step that can with certainty free both herself and Bertoldo from the bond they had created, by retiring into a nunnery. This explanation renders the action of the play clear, and at the same time shows that Shakespeare, in his conduct, with regard to his marriage, may have been behaving in the most honourable and praiseworthy manner, as the bond, with the date of which the date of the birth of his first child is compared, is for the purpose of exonerating the ecclesiastics from any liability for performing the ecclesiastical ceremony, which was not at all a necessary preliminary to a valid marriage, so far as the husband and wife were concerned, although it was essential to render issue of the marriage legitimate. These are instances of the deceptions that are likely to arise from the two fertile sources that have been specified. There can be no doubt that the existence of errors arising from the former source, misapprehension in the meaning of words, is very generally admitted, and effectual remedies have been supplied by modern scholars for those who will make use of them. Errors arising from the latter source are not so entirely recognized, or so securely guarded against. But what has just been said surely shows that it is of no use reading a writer of a past age with merely modern conceptions, and, therefore, that if such a man's works are worth study at all, they must be read with the help of the light thrown upon them by contemporary history, literature, laws, and morals. The student must endeavor to divest himself, as far as possible, of all ideas that are the result of a development subsequent to the time in which his author lived, and to place himself in harmony with the life and the thoughts of the people of that age. Sit down with them in their homes, and learn the sources of their loves, their hates, their fears, and see wherein domestic happiness, or lack of it, made them strong or weak. Follow them to the marketplace, and witness their dealings with their fellows, the honesty or baseness of them, and trace the cause. Look into their very hearts, if it may be, as they kneel, at the devotion they feel or simulate, and become acquainted with the springs of their dearest aspirations and most secret prayers. A hard discipline, no doubt, but not more hard than salutary. Salutary in two ways. First, as a test of the student's own earnestness of purpose. For in these days of revival of interest in our elder literature, it has become much the custom for flippant persons, who are covetous of being thought well read by their less enterprising companions, to skim over the surface of the pages of the wisest and noblest of our great teachers, either not understanding or misunderstanding them. I have read Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, is the sublimely satirical expression constantly heard from the mouths of those who, having read words set down by the men they name, have no more capacity for reading the hearts of the men themselves through these words than a blind man has for discerning the color of flowers. As a consequence of this flippancy of reading, numberless writers, whose works have long been consigned to a well-merited oblivion, have of late years been disinterred and held up for public admiration, chiefly upon the ground that they are ancient and unknown. The man who reads for the sake of having done so, not for the sake of the knowledge gained by doing so, finds as much charm in these petty writers as in the greater, and hence their transient and undeserved popularity. It would be well, then, for every earnest student, before beginning the study of anyone having pretensions to the position of a master, and who is not of our own generation, to ask himself, am I prepared thoroughly to sift out and ascertain the true import of every allusion contained in this volume? And if he cannot honestly answer yes, let him shut the book, assured that he is not impelled to the study of it by a sincere thirst for knowledge, but by impertinent curiosity, or a shallow desire to obtain undeserved credit for learning. The second way in which such a discipline will prove salutary is this. It will prevent the student from straying too far afield in his reading. The number of classical authors whose works will repay such severe study is extremely limited. However much enthusiasm he may throw into his studies, he will find that 9/10 of our older literature yields too small a harvest of instruction to attract any but the pedant to expend so much labor upon them. The two great vices of modern reading will be avoided, flippancy on the one hand, and pedantry on the other. The object, therefore, which I have had in view of the compilation of the following pages, is to attempt to throw some additional light upon a condition of thought utterly different from any belief that has firm hold in the present generation, that was current and peculiarly prominent during the lifetime of the man who bears overwhelmingly the greatest name, either in our own or any other literature. It may be said, and perhaps with much force, that enough, and more than enough, has been written in the way of Shakespeare criticism. But is it not better that somewhat too much should be written upon a subject than too little? We cannot expect that everyone shall see all the greatness of Shakespeare's vast and complex mind. By one, a truth will be grasped that has eluded the vigilance of others, and it is better that those who can by no possibility grasp anything at all should have patient hearing, rather than that any additional light should be lost. The useless, lifeless criticism vanishes quietly away into chaos. The good remains quietly to be useful. And it is in reliance upon the justice and certainty of this law that I aim in bringing before the mind, as clearly as may be, a phase of belief that was continually and powerfully influencing Shakespeare during the whole of his life, but is now well nigh forgotten or entirely misunderstood. If the endeavour is a useless and unprofitable one, let it be forgotten. I am content. But I hope to be able to show that an investigation of the subject does furnish us with a key which, in a manner, unlocks the secrets of Shakespeare's heart, and brings us closer to the real living man, to the very soul of him who, with hardly any history in the accepted sense of the word, has left us in his works a biography of far deeper and more precious meaning, if we will but understand it. But it may be said that Shakespeare, of all men, is able to speak for himself, without aid or comment. His works appeal to all, young and old, in every time, every nation. It is true, he can be understood. He is, to use again Ben Jonson's oft-quoted words, not of an age, but for all time. Yet he is so thoroughly imbued with the spirit and opinions of his era, that without a certain comprehension of the men of the Elizabethan period, he cannot be understood fully. Indeed, his greatness is to a large extent due to his sympathy with the men around him, his power of clearly thinking out the answers to the all-time questions, and giving a voice to them that his contemporaries could understand, answers that others could not for themselves formulate, could, perhaps, only vaguely and dimly feel after. To understand these answers fully, the language in which they were delivered must be first thoroughly mastered. I intend, therefore, to attempt to sketch out the leading features of a phase of religious belief that acquired peculiar distinctness and prominence during Shakespeare's lifetime, more, perhaps, than it ever did before, or has done since. The belief in the existence of evil spirits, and their influence upon and dealings with mankind. The subject will be treated in 3 sections. The first will contain a short statement of the laws that seem to be of universal operation in the creation and maintenance of the belief in a multitudinous band of spirits, good and evil, and of a few of the conditions upon the Elizabethan epic that may have had a formative and modifying influence upon that belief. The second will be devoted to an outline of the chief features of that belief as it existed at the time in question, the organization, appearance, and various functions and powers of the evil spirits, with special reference to Shakespeare's plays. The third and concluding section will embody an attempt to trace the growth of Shakespeare's thought upon religious matters through the medium of his allusions to this subject. End of section 1. Section 2 of Elizabethan Demonology by Thomas Alfred Spalding. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Eva Davis. Section 2. The empire of the supernatural must obviously be most extended where civilization is the least advanced. An educated man has to make a conscious and sometimes severe effort to refrain from pronouncing a dogmatic opinion as to the cause of a given result when sufficient evidence to warrant a definite conclusion is wanting. To the savage, the notion of any necessity for or advantage to be derived from, such self-restraint never once occurs. Neither the lightning that strikes his hut, the blight that withers his crops, the disease that destroys the life of those he loves, nor, on the other hand, the beneficent sunshine or life-giving rain, is by him traceable to any known physical cause. They are the results of influences utterly beyond his understanding, supernatural, matters upon which imagination is allowed free scope to run riot, and from which spring up a legion of myths, or attempts to represent in some manner these incomprehensible processes, grotesque or poetic, according to the character of the people with which they originate, which, if their growth be not disturbed by extraneous influences, eventually develop into the national creed. The most ordinary events of the savage's everyday life do not admit of a natural solution. His whole existence is bound in, from birth to death, by a network of miracles, and regulated in its smallest details by unseen powers of whom he knows little or nothing. Hence it is that in primitive societies the functions of legislator, judge, priest, and medicine man are all combined in one individual, the great medium of communication between man and the unknown, whose person is preeminently sacred. The laws that are to guide the community come in some mysterious manner through him from the higher powers. If two members of the clan are involved in a quarrel, he is appealed to apply some test in order to ascertain which of the two is in the wrong, an ordeal that can have no judicial operation, except on the assumption of the existence of omnipotent beings interested in the discovery of evildoers, who will prevent the test from operating unjustly. Maladies and famines are unmistakable signs of the displeasure of the good, or spite of the bad spirits, and are to be averted by some propitiatory act on the part of the sufferers, or the mediation of the priest-doctor. The remedy that would put an end to a long-continued drought will be equally effective in arresting an epidemic. But who, and of what nature, are these supernatural powers, whose influences are thus brought to bear upon everyday life, and who appear to take such an interest in the affairs of mankind? It seems that there are three great principles at work in the evolution and modification of the ideas upon this subject, which must now be shortly stated. The first of these is the apparent incapacity of the majority of mankind to accept a purely monotheistic creed. It is a demonstrable fact that the primitive religions now open to observation attribute specific events and results to distinct supernatural beings, and there can be little doubt that this is the initial step in every creed. It is a bold and somewhat perilous revolution to attempt to overturn this doctrine and to set up monotheism in its place, and, when successfully accomplished, is rarely permanent. The more educated portions of the community maintain allegiance to the new teaching, perhaps, but among the lower classes it soon becomes degraded to, or amalgamated with, some form of polytheism more or less pronounced, and either secret or declared. Even the Jews, the nation the most conspicuous for its supposed uncompromising adherence to a monotheistic creed, cannot claim absolute freedom from taint in this respect, for in the country places, far from the center of worship, the people were constantly following after strange gods, and even some of their most notable worthies were liable to the same accusation. It is not necessary, however, that the individuality and specialization of function of the supreme beings recognized by any religious system should be so conspicuous as they are in this case, or in the Greek or Roman pantheon, to mark it as in its essence polytheistic, or of polytheistic tendency. It is quite enough that the immortals are deemed to be capable of hearing and answering the prayers of their adorers, and of interfering actively in passing events either for good or for evil. This, at the root of it, constitutes the crucial difference between polytheism and monotheism, and in this sense the Roman Catholic form of Christianity, representing the oldest undisturbed evolution of a strictly monotheistic doctrine, is undeniably polytheistic. Apart from the Virgin Mary, there is a whole hierarchy of inferior deities, saints, and angels, subordinate to the one supreme being. This may possibly be denied by the authorized expounders of the doctrine of the Church of Rome, but it is nevertheless certain that it is the view taken by the uneducated classes, with whom the saints are much more present and definite deities than even the Almighty himself. It is worth noting that during the dancing mania of 1418, not God, or Christ, or the Virgin Mary, but Saint Vitus was prayed to by the populace to stop the epidemic that was afterwards known by his name. There was a temple to Saint Michael on Mount St. Angelo, and Augustine thought it necessary to declare that angel worshippers were heretics. Even Protestantism, though a much younger growth than Catholicism, shows a slight tendency toward polytheism. The saints are, of course, quite out of the question, and angels are as far as possible relegated from the citadel of asserted belief into the vaguer regions of poetical sentimentality. But, although again unadmitted by the orthodox of the sect, the popular conception of Christ is, and until the masses are more educated in theological niceties than they are at present, necessarily must be, as of a supreme being totally distinct from God the Father. This applies in a less degree to the third person in the Trinity. Less, because his individuality is less clear. George Eliot has, with her usual penetration, noted this fact in Silas Marner, where, in Mrs. Winthrop's simple theological system, the Trinity is always referred to as them. The posthumous history of Francis of Assisi affords a striking illustration of this strange tendency towards polytheism. This extraordinary man received no little reverence and adulation during his lifetime, but it was not until after his death that the process of deification commenced. It was then discovered that the stigmata were not the only points of resemblance between the departed saint and the divine master he professed to follow, that his birth had been foretold by the prophets, that, like Christ, he underwent transfiguration, and that he had worked miracles during his life. The climax of the apotheosis was reached in 1486, when a monk preaching at Paris seriously maintained that Saint Francis was in very truth a second Christ, the second Son of God, and that after his death he descended into purgatory and liberated all the spirits confined there, who had the good fortune to be arrayed in the Franciscan garb. The second principle is that of the Manichaeists, the division of spirits into hostile camps, good and evil. This is a much more common belief than the orthodox are willing to allow. There is hardly any religious system that does not recognize a first source of evil, as well as a first source of good. But the spirit of evil occupies a position of varying importance. In some systems, he maintains himself as a co-equal of the spirit of good. In others, he sinks to a lower stage, remaining very powerful to do harm, but nevertheless under the control, in matters of the highest importance, of the more beneficent being. In each of these cases, the first principle is found operating, ever augmenting the ranks, monodiabolism being as impossible as monotheism, and hence the importance of fully establishing that proposition. The last and most important of these principles is the tendency of all theological systems to absorb into themselves the deities extraneous to themselves, not as gods, but as inferior or even evil spirits. The actual existence of the foreign deity is not for a moment disputed, the presumption in favor of innumerable spiritual agencies being far too strong to allow the possibility of such a doubt. But just as the alien is looked upon as an inferior being, created chiefly for the use and benefit of the chosen people, and what nation is not, if its opinion of itself may be relied upon, a chosen people, so the God the alien worships is a spirit of inferior power and capacity, and can be recognized solely as occupying a position subordinate to that of the gods of the land. This principle has such an important influence in the elaboration of the belief in demons that it is worth while to illustrate the generality of its application. In the Greek system of theology, we find in the first place a number of deities of varying importance and power, whose special functions are defined with some distinctness, and then, below these, an innumerable band of spirits, the souls of the departed, probably the relics of an earlier pure ancestor worship, who still interest themselves in the inhabitants of this world. These, Greek daimones, were certainly accredited with supernatural power, and were not of necessity either good or evil in their influence or action. It was to this second class that foreign deities were assimilated. They found it impossible, however, to retain even this humble position. The ceremonies of their worship, and the language in which those ceremonies were performed, were strange to the inhabitants of the land in which the acclimatization was attempted, and the incomprehensible is first suspected, then loathed. It is not surprising, then, that the newcomers soon fell into the ranks of purely evil spirits, and that those who persisted in exercising their rites were stigmatized as devil worshippers or magicians. But in process of time, this polytheistic system became preeminently unsatisfactory to the thoughtful men whom Greece produced in such numbers. The tendency towards monotheism, which is usually associated with the name of Plato, is hinted at in the writings of other philosophers who were his predecessors. The effect of this revolution was to recognize one supreme being, the first cause, and to subordinate to him all the other deities of the ancient and popular theology, to coordinate them, in fact, with the older class of demons, the first step in the descent to the lowest category of all. The history of the Neoplatonic belief is one of elaboration upon these ideas. The conception of the Supreme Being was complicated in a manner closely resembling the idea of the Christian Trinity, and all the subordinate demons were classified into good and evil geniuses. Thus, a theoretically monotheistic system was established, with a tremendous hierarchy of inferior spirits, who frequently bore the names of the ancient gods and goddesses of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, strikingly resembling that of Roman Catholicism. The subordinate demons were not at first recognized as entitled to any religious rites, but in the course of time, by the inevitable operation of the first principle just enunciated, a form of theurgy sprang up, with the object of attracting the kindly help and patronage of the good spirits, and was tolerated. And attempts were made to hold intercourse with the evil spirits, which were, as far as possible, suppressed and discountenanced. The history of the operation of this principle upon the Jewish religion is very similar and extremely interesting. Although they do not seem to have ever had any system of ancestor worship, as the Greeks had, yet the Jews appear originally to have recognized the deities of their neighbors as existing spirits, but inferior in power to the God of Israel. All the gods of the nations are idols are words that entirely fail to convey the idea of the psalmist. For the word translated idols is Elohim, the very term usually employed to designate Jehovah, and the true sense of the passage, therefore, is, all the gods of the nations are gods, but Jehovah made the heavens. In another place we read that the Lord is a great God, and a great King above all gods. As, however, the Jews gradually became acquainted with the barbarous rites with which their neighbors did honor to their gods, the foreigners seem to have fallen more and more in estimation, until they came to be classed as evil spirits. To this process, such names as Beelzebub, Moloch, Ashtaroth, and Belial bear witness. Beelzebub, the prince of the devils of later time, being one of the gods of the hostile Philistines. The introduction of Christianity made no difference in this respect. Paul says to the believers at Corinth that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils, Greek, daimonia, and not to God, and I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. And the Septuagint renders the word Elohim in the 95th Psalm by this, Greek, daimonia, which, as the Christians had already a distinct term for good spirits, came to be applied to evil ones only. Under the influence, therefore, of the new religion, the gods of Greece and Rome, who in the days of their supremacy had degraded so many foreign deities to the position of demons, were in their turn deposed from their high estate, and became the nucleus around which the Christian belief in demonology formed itself. The gods who under the old theologies reigned paramount in the lower regions became preeminently diabolic in character in the new system, and it was Hecate who to the last retained her position of active patroness and encourager of witchcraft, a practice which became almost indissolubly connected with her name. Numerous instances of the completeness with which this process of diabolization was effected, and the firmness with which it retained its hold upon the popular belief, even to late times, might be given, but the following must suffice. In one of the miracle plays, The Conversion of Saul, a council of devils is held, at which Mercury appears as the messenger of Belial. But this absolute rejection of every pagan belief and ceremony was characteristic of the Christian Church in its infancy only. So long as the band of believers was a small and persecuted one, no temptation to violate the rule could exist. But as the Church grew and acquired influence and position, it discovered that good policy demanded that the sternness and inflexibility of its youthful theories should undergo some modification. It found that it was not the most successful method of enticing stragglers into its fold to stigmatize the gods they ignorantly worshipped as devils, and to persecute them as magicians. The more impetuous and enthusiastic supporters did persecute, and persecute most relentlessly, the adherents of the dying faith. But persecution, whether of good or evil, always fails as a means of suppressing a hated doctrine, unless it can be carried to the extent of extermination of its supporters. And the more far-seeing leaders of the Catholic Church soon recognized that a slight surrender of principle was a far surer road to success than stubborn, uncompromising opposition. It was in this spirit that the Catholics dealt with the oracles of heathendom. Mr. Lecky is hardly correct when he says that nothing analogous to the ancient oracles was incorporated with Christianity. There is the notable case of the god Sosthenion, whom Constantine identified with the archangel Michael, and whose oracular functions were continued in a precisely similar manner by the latter. Oracles that were not thus absorbed and supported were recognized as existent, but under diabolic control, and to be tolerated, if not patronized, by the representatives of the dominant religion. The oracle at Delphi gave forth prophetic utterances for centuries after the commencement of the Christian era, and was the less dangerous, as its operations could be stopped at any moment by holding a saintly relic to the god or devil Apollo's nose. There is a fable that St. Gregory, in the course of his travels, passed near the oracle, and his extraordinary sanctity was such as to prevent all subsequent utterances. This so disturbed the presiding genius of the place, that he appealed to the saint to undo the baneful effects his presence had produced, and Gregory benevolently wrote a letter to the devil, which was in fact a license to continue the business of prophesying unmolested. This nonsensical fiction shows clearly enough that the oracles were not generally looked upon as extinguished by Christianity. As the result of a similar policy, we find the names and functions of the pagan gods and the earlier Christian saints confused in the most extraordinary manner, the saints assuming the duties of the moribund deities, where those duties were of a harmless or necessary character. The Church carried out exactly the same principles in her missionary efforts among the heathen hordes of northern Europe. Do you renounce the devils and all their words and works? Thoner, Woden, and Saxonot was part of the form of recantation administered to the Scandinavian converts. And at the present day, Odin take you is the Norse equivalent of the devil take you. On the other hand, an attempt was made to identify Balder the Beautiful with Christ, a confusion of character that may go far towards accounting for a custom joyously observed by our forefathers at Christmastide, but which the false modesty of modern society has nearly succeeded in banishing from amongst us. For Balder was slain by Loki with a branch of mistletoe, and Christ was betrayed by Judas with a kiss. Upon the conversion of the inhabitants of Great Britain to Christianity, the native deities underwent the same inevitable fate, and sank into the rank of evil spirits. Perhaps the juster opinion is that they became the progenitors of our fairy mythology, rather than the subsequent devil lore, although the similarity between these two classes of spirits is sufficient to warrant us in classing them as species of the same genus, their characters and functions being perfectly interchangeable, and even at times merging and becoming indistinguishable. A certain lurking affection in the new converts for the religion they had deserted, perhaps under compulsion, may have led them to look upon their ancient objects of veneration as less detestable in nature and dangerous in act than the devils imported as an integral portion of their adopted faith, and so originated this class of spirits less evil than the other. Sir Walter Scott may be correct in his assertion that many of these fairy myths owe their origin to the existence of a diminutive, autochthonic race that was conquered by the invading Celts, and the remnants of which lurked about the mountains and forests, and excited in their victors a superstitious reverence on account of their great skill in metallurgy. But this will not explain the retention of many of the old god names, that of the Doozy, the Celtic nocturnal spirits, in our word Duse, and that of the Neck, or water spirits, in Nixie and Old Nick. These words undoubtedly indicate the accomplishment of the Facilis Discensus Averno by the native deities. Elves, brownies, gnomes, and trolls were all at one time Scotch or Irish gods. The trolls obtained a character similar to that of the more modern succubus, and have left their impression upon Elizabethan English in the word trull. End of section 2. Section 3 of Elizabethan Demonology by Thomas Alfred Spalding. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Eva Davis. The preceding very superficial outline of the growth of the belief in evil spirits is enough for the purpose of this essay, as it shows that the basis of English devil lore was the annihilated mythologies of the ancient heathen religions, Italic and Teutonic, as well as those brought into direct conflict with the Jewish system, and also that the more important of the Teutonic deities are not to be traced in the subsequent hierarchy of fiends, on account, probably, of their temporary or permanent absorption into the proselytizing system, or the refusal of the new converts to believe them to be so black as their teachers painted them. The gradual growth of the superstructure it would be well nigh impossible and quite unprofitable to trace. It is due chiefly to the credulous ignorance and distorted imagination, monkish and otherwise, of several centuries. Carlyle's graphic picture of Abbot Sampson's vision of the devil in past and present will perhaps do more to explain how the belief grew and flourished than pages of explanatory statements. It is worthy of remark, however, that to the last communications with evil spirits was kept up by means of formulae and rites that are undeniably the remnants of a form of religious worship. incomprehensible in their jargon, as these formulae mostly are, and strongly tinctured as they have become, with burlesqued Christian symbolism and expression, for those who used them could only supply the fast-dying memory of the elder forms from the existing system. They still, in all their grotesqueness, remain the battered relics of a dead faith. Such being the natural history of the conflict of religions, it will not be a matter of surprise that the leaders of our English Reformation should, in their turn, have attributed the miracles of the Roman Catholic saints to the same infernal source as the early Christians supposed to have been the origin of the prodigies and oracles of paganism. The impulse given by the secession from the Church of Rome to the study of the Bible by all classes added impetus to this tendency. In Holy Writ, the Reformers found full authority for believing in the existence of evil spirits, possession by devils, witchcraft, and divine and diabolic interference by way of miracle generally. And they consequently acknowledged the possibility of the repetition of such phenomena in the times in which they lived. A position more tenable, perhaps, than that of modern orthodoxy, that accepts without murmur all the supernatural events recorded in the Bible, and utterly rejects all subsequent relations of a similar nature, however well authenticated. The Reformers believed unswervingly in the truth of the biblical accounts of miracles, and that what God had once permitted to take place might and would be repeated in case of serious necessity. But they found it utterly impossible to accept the puerile and meaningless miracles perpetrated under the auspices of the Roman Catholic Church as evidence of divine interference. And they had not travelled far enough upon the road towards rationalism to be able to reject them one and all, as in their very nature impossible. The consequence of this was one of those compromises which we so often meet with in the history of the changes of opinion effected by the Reformation. Only those particular miracles that were indisputably demonstrated to be impostures, and there were plenty of them, such as the Rood of Boxley, were treated as such by them. The unexposed remainder were treated as genuine supernatural phenomena, but caused by diabolical, not divine, agency. The reforming divine Caulfield, supporting this view of the Catholic miracles in his answer to Marshall's treatise of the Cross, points out that the majority of supernatural events that have taken place in this world have been, most undoubtedly, the work of the devil, and puts his opponents into a rather embarrassing dilemma by citing the miracles of paganism, which both Catholic and Protestant concurred in attributing to the evil one. He then clinches his argument by asserting that it is the devil's cunning that persuades those that will walk in a popish blindness that they are worshipping God when they are in reality serving him. Therefore, he continues, consciously following an argument of Saint Cyprianus against the pagan miracles, these wicked spirits do lurk in shrines, in roods, in crosses, in images, and first of all pervert the priests, which are easiest to be caught with bait of a little gain. Then work they miracles. They appear to men in divers shapes, disquiet them when they are awake, trouble them in their sleeps, distort their members, take away their health, afflict them with diseases, only to bring them to some idolatry. Thus, when they have obtained their purpose, that a lewd affiance is reposed where it should not, they enter, as it were, into a new league, and trouble them no more. What do the simple people then? Verily suppose that the image, the cross, the thing that they have kneeled and offered unto, the very devil indeed, hath restored them to health, whereas he did nothing but leave off to molest them. This is the help and cure that the devils give when they leave off their wrong and injury. Here we have a distinct charge of devil worship, the old doctrine cropping up again after centuries of repose. All the gods of our opponents are devils. Nor were Catholics a whit behind the Protestants in this matter. The priests zealously taught that the Protestants were devil worshippers and magicians, and the common people so implicitly believed in the truth of the statement that we find one poor prisoner, taken by the Dutch at the siege of Alkmaar in 1578, making a desperate attempt to save his life by promising to worship his captor's devil precisely as they did, a suggestion that failed to pacify those to whom it was addressed. Having thus stated, so far as necessary, the chief laws that are constantly working the extension of the domain of the supernatural as far as demonology is concerned, without a remembrance of which the subject itself would remain somewhat difficult to comprehend fully, I shall now attempt to indicate one or two conditions of thought and circumstance that may have tended to increase and vivify the belief during the period in which the Elizabethan literature flourished. It was an era of change. The nation was emerging from the dim twilight of medievalism into the full day of political and religious freedom. But the morning mists, which the rising sun had not yet dispelled, rendered the more distant and complex objects distorted and pretentious. The very fact that doubt, or rather, perhaps, independence of thought, was at last, within certain limits, treated as non-criminal in theology, gave an impetus to investigation and speculation in all branches of politics and science. And with this change came, in the main, improvement. But the great defect of the time was that this newly liberated spirit of free inquiry was not kept in check by any sufficient previous discipline in logical methods of reasoning. Hence the possibility of the wild theories that then existed, followed out into action or not, according as circumstances favored or discouraged. Arthur Hackett, with casting out of devils and other madnesses, vehemently declaring himself the Messiah and King of Europe in the year of grace 1591, and getting himself believed by some, so long as he remained unhanged. Or, more pathetic still, many weary lives wasted day by day in fruitless, silent search after the impossible philosopher's stone, or elixir of life. As in law, so in science, there were no sufficient rules of evidence clearly and unmistakably laid down for the guidance of the investigator, and consequently it was only necessary to broach a novel theory in order to have it accepted, without any previous serious testing. Men do not seem to have been able to distinguish between a hypothesis and a proved conclusion, or rather the rule of presumptions was reversed, and men accepted the hypothesis as conclusive until it was disproved. It was a perfectly rational and sufficient explanation in those days to refer some extraordinary event to some given supernatural cause, even though there might be no ostensible link between the two. Now, such a suggestion would be treated by the vast majority with derision or contempt. On the other hand, the most trivial occurrences, such as sneezing, the appearance of birds of ill omen, the crowing of a cock, and events of like unimportance happening at a particular moment, might, by some unseen concatenation of causes and effects, exercise an incomprehensible influence upon men, and consequently had important bearings upon their conduct. It is solemnly recorded in the Commons journals that during the discussion of the statute against witchcraft passed in the reign of James I, a young jackdaw flew into the house, which accident was generally regarded as a malum omen to the bill. Extraordinary bravery on the part of an adversary was sometimes accounted for by asserting that he was the devil in the form of a man, as the Volscian soldier does with regard to Coriolanus. This is no mere dramatist's fancy, but a fixed belief of the times. Sir William Russell fought so desperately at Zutphen that he got mistaken for the evil one, and Drake also gave the Spaniards good reason for believing that he was a devil and no man. This intense credulousness, childish almost in itself, but yet at the same time combined with the strong man's intellect, permeated all classes of society. Perhaps a couple of instances, drawn from strangely diverse sources, will bring this more vividly before the mind than any amount of attempted theorizing. The first is one of the tricks of the jugglers of the period. to make one dance naked. Make a poor boy confederate with you, so as after charms, etc., spoken by you, he unclothe himself and stand naked, seeming, whilst he undresseth himself, to shake, stamp, and cry, still hastening to be unclothed, till he be stark naked. Or, if you can procure none to go so far, let him only begin to stamp and shake, etc., and unclothe him, and then you may, for the reverence of the company, seem to release him. The second illustration must have demanded, if possible, more credulity on the part of the audience than this harmless entertainment. Cranmer tells us that in the time of Queen Mary a monk preached a sermon at St. Paul's, the object of which was to prove the truth of the doctrine of transubstantiation, and, after the manner of his kind, told the following little anecdote in support of it. A maid of Northgate parish in Canterbury, in pretence to wipe her mouth, kept the host in her handkerchief, and, when she came home, she put the same into a pot, close covered, and she spitted into another pot, and after a few days, she, looking in the one pot, found a little young pretty babe, about a shaftmond long, and the other pot was full of gore blood. That the audiences before which these absurdities were seriously brought, for amusement or instruction, could be excited in either case to any other feeling than good-natured contempt for a would-be impostor, seems to us nowadays to be impossible. It was not so in the times when these things transpired. The actors of them were not knaves, nor were their audiences fools to any unusual extent. If anyone is inclined to form a low opinion of the Elizabethans intellectually, on account of the divergence of their capacities of belief in this respect from his own, he does them a great injustice. Let him take at once Charles Lamb's warning, and try to understand rather than to judge them. We, who have had the benefit of 300 more years of experience and liberty of thought than they, should have to hide our faces, for very shame, had we not arrived at juster and truer conclusions upon these difficult topics that so bewildered our ancestors. But can we, with all our boasted advantages of wealth, power, and knowledge, truly say that all our aims are as high, all our desires as pure, our words as true, and our deeds as noble, as those whose opinions we feel this tendency to contemn? If not, or if indeed they have anything whatsoever to teach us in these respects, let us remember that we shall never learn the lesson wholly, perhaps not learn it at all, unless, casting aside this first impulse to despise, we try to enter fully into and understand these strange dead beliefs of the past. It is in this spirit that I now enter upon the second division of the subject in hand, in which I shall try to indicate the chief features of the belief in demonology as it existed during the Elizabethan period. These will be taken up in 3 main heads: the classification, physical appearance, and powers of the evil spirits. It is difficult to discover any classification of devils as well authenticated and as universally received as that of the angels introduced by Dionysius the Areopagite, which was subsequently imported into the creed of the Western Church, and popularized in Elizabethan times by Decker's hierarchy. The subject was one which, from its nature, could not be settled ex cathedra, and consequently the subject had to grow up as best it might, each writer adopting the arrangement that appeared to him most suitable. There was one rough but popular classification into greater and lesser devils. The former branch was subdivided into classes of various grades of power, the members of which passed under the titles of kings, dukes, marquises, lords, captains, and other dignitaries. Each of these was supposed to have a certain number of legions of the latter class under his command. These were the evil spirits who appeared most frequently on the earth as the emissaries of the greater fiends, to carry out their evil designs. The more important class kept for the most part in a mystical seclusion, and only appeared upon earth in cases of the greatest emergency, or when compelled to do so by conjuration. To the class of lesser devils belonged the bad angel which, together with a good one, was supposed to be assigned to every person at birth, to follow him through life, the one to tempt, the other to guard from temptation, so that a struggle similar to that recorded between Michael and Satan for the body of Moses was raging for the soul of every existing human being. This was not a mere theory, but a vital active belief, as the beautiful well-known lines at the commencement of the 8th canto of the 2nd book of the Fairy Queen, and the use made of these opposing spirits in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and in the Virgin Martyr by Messenger and Decker, conclusively show. Another classification, which seems to retain a reminiscence of the origin of devils from pagan deities, is effected by reference to the localities supposed to be inhabited by the different classes of evil spirits. According to this arrangement, we get 6 classes. 1. Devils of the fire, who wander in the region near the moon. 2. Devils of the air, who hover round the earth. 3. Devils of the earth, to whom the fairies are allied. 4. Devils of the water. 5. Submundane devils. 6. Lucifugi. These devils' power and desire to injure mankind appear to have increased with the proximity of their location to the earth's center, but this classification had nothing like the hold upon the popular mind that the former grouping had, and may consequently be dismissed with this mention. End of Section 3. Section 4 of Elizabethan Demonology by Thomas Alfred Spalding. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Eva Davis. Section 4. The greater devils, or the most important of them, had distinguishing names. Strange, uncouth names, some of them telling of a heathenish origin, others inexplicable and almost unpronounceable, such as Ashtaroth, Baal, Belial, Zephyr, Cerberus, Phoenix, Balaam, why he, and Hagentai, Lyrae, Marcosius, Gazoin, Glasiolabulus. Scott enumerates 79, the above amongst them, and he does not by any means exhaust the number. As each archdevil had 20, 30, or 40 legions of inferior spirits under his command, and a legion was composed of 666 devils, it is not surprising that the latter did not obtain distinguishing names until they made their appearance upon earth, when they frequently obtained one from the form they loved to assume. For example, the familiars of the witches in Macbeth, Paddock, Toad, Grimalkin, Cat, and Harper, Harpy possibly. Is it surprising that, with resources of this nature at his command, such an adept in the art of necromancy as Owen Glendower should hold Harry Percy, much to his disgust, at the least 9 hours, in reckoning up the several devils' names that were his lackeys? Of the 20 devils mentioned by Shakespeare, 4 only belong to the class of greater devils. Hecate, the principal patroness of witchcraft, is referred to frequently, and appears once upon the scene. The 2 others are Amymon and Barbazon, both of whom are mentioned twice. Amymon was a very important personage, being no other than one of the 4 kings. Ziminar was king of the north, and is referred to in Henry VI, Part 1. Gorson of the south, Goap of the west, and Amymon of the east. He is mentioned in Henry IV, Part 1, and Merry Wives. Barbazon also occurs in the same passage in the latter play, and again in Henry V, a fact that does, to a slight extent, help to bear out the otherwise ascertained chronological sequence of these plays. The remainder of the devils belong to the second class. 9 of these occur in King Lear, and will be referred to again when the subject of possession is touched upon. It would appear that each of the greater devils, on the rare occasion upon which he made his appearance upon earth, assumed a form peculiar to himself. The lesser devils, on the other hand, had an ordinary type, common to the whole species, with a capacity for almost infinite variation and transmutation, which they used, as will be seen, to the extreme perplexity and annoyance of mortals. As an illustration in the form of which a greater devil might appear, this is what Scott says of the questionable Balaam above mentioned. Balaam cometh with 3 heads, the first